Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. As I'm sure some of you know, 2 years ago my wife and I moved from England to the United States, specifically to here, Charlotte, North Carolina. My wife and I, being walkers, quickly did most of the recommended walks in the kind of surrounding area. One such walk that we both did early on was just across the border in South Carolina on the Catawba Indian Reservation. There you will find the Catawba Greenway, a short walk that runs alongside the Catawba River, a stretch of river which has maintained its pre-development conditions, where you can glimpse what the river might have looked like before Europeans entered the picture. Given my interest in Mormonism, I tend to find that Mormon churches catch my attention when I'm looking at maps. I noticed that right alongside the Catawba Reservation was one such Mormon church, and I had no idea when I first noticed that church the rabbit hole that it would bring me down. Okay, so let me backtrack and begin. Catawba means people of the river. They were an East Coast tribe that occupied a broad territory throughout the Piedmont region. That's across North and South Carolina. They were one of the most powerful tribes in the area. Like all American tribes, when Europeans arrived in the 16th century, their numbers were decimated by disease, by smallpox, measles, influenza, and so forth. Over the next couple of centuries, their interactions with Europeans increased. They became involved in the deerskin trade. They allied themselves with the British and fought alongside them against the French and other Native American tribes that were enemies of the Catawba. All the while, their numbers continued to plummet through disease and war. The Catawba Indians supported the American colonialists during the American Revolutionary War, though this did little in the way of improving their circumstances. Joseph Smith officially founded the Mormon Church, known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in 1830. Missionary work in the church started almost straight away. It was in that same decade, in the 1930s, that missionaries were even sent overseas, to England, and then to Scotland, and then further afield. But before the church even got to any of this international missionary work, something that they are, of course, well known for today, in 1830 they sent missionaries to the Lamanites, which is to say, to the Native Americans. That's because Native Americans are very significant in Mormon theology. So when Joseph Smith was growing up, there was a lot of lore surrounding the Native Americans in the air. Speculation as to where they came from. Various myths circulated. Maybe they were the descendants of some ancient civilization, perhaps the Egyptians or the Phoenicians, or maybe they were somehow connected to the lost city of Atlantis. There was also the noble savage stereotype, that these native peoples were somehow not molested or corrupted by the influences of civilization, and were as such more pure, existing in a more natural state. And also there was the idea that they were the descendants of Israelites. They were one of the lost tribes of Israel. These ideas found their way into the Book of Mormon, which the church claims was translated from golden plates unearthed by Joseph Smith, and that I think, and what I think common sense would lead one to believe, a book written by Joseph Smith. I'm not going into a lot of detail here. I've done an overview of the Book of Mormon before, which I'll link up there. But just for our purposes, the Book of Mormon tells the story of multiple tribes, most significantly the Lamanites and the Nephites, sailing to America from Israel. It's in many ways a kind of reimagining of the Old Testament. There are cycles of war, peace, spiritual decline, and renewal. After Jesus dies and is resurrected in the first century as per the New Testament narrative, he then visits the peoples of America. He goes to them to depart to them the true gospel. But ultimately, that true gospel amongst the natives is corrupted. Eventually, there is a great battle between these two great tribes, and the Nephites are destroyed. So that leaves the Lamanites, who Mormons believe ultimately forgot their history, their heritage, their religion, and became the various tribes that we know today as the Native Americans. So, as such, Mormons don't see themselves as much as taking a Eurocentric Christianity to these peoples of America. Quite the opposite. By bringing the gospel to the natives, according to the Mormons, what you're doing is you're reintroducing them to their true heritage. The idea is that Joseph Smith, in the 19th century, represented a restoration of the gospel. And what could be more glorious in this restoration than if it led to these lost peoples, these wandering sheep, being returned to the fold, being restored to the true gospel? So, yes, the mission to the Lamanites. Joseph Smith sent missionaries out to Native Americans in 1830, ultimately to Indians in New York State, Ohio, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And I think it's fair to say that the mission to the Lamanites in terms of actually converting natives was pretty unsuccessful. But, as we will see, these attempts to convert Native Americans certainly did not end there. By the end of the 19th century, the Catawba Tribe had been reduced to about 100 to 120 people. They'd already encountered other Christian missionaries, most notably the Anglican priest Charles Woodmason, but the Catawba people had been unreceptive. In 1883, the Mormons arrived, Henry Miller and Charles E. Robinson, to proselytize to the Catawba people, and they found success quickly. The Mormons in general were not welcome in the South. Anything other than Christian orthodoxy was regarded with skepticism. Southerners were also resistant to the Mormons because they freely associated themselves with the Indians. This is part of the reason why conversion to Mormonism in the late 19th century was an appealing prospect for the Catawba Indians. Here were white Christians that regarded them with greater racial parity, especially when compared to what they otherwise encountered in Southern culture at large. There was a promise in Mormon teachings that in converting, they would be recognized as white and delightsome. The Book of Mormon has very much woven into it this duality, light and dark, pure and impure, and that this duality manifests itself externally in the color of our skin. By converting, the Catawba Indians were redefining their racial identity. They were attaining upward mobility, and perhaps most critically, they were distancing themselves from African Americans. Mormons, compared to Americans at large, were racially tolerant towards the natives in the 19th century, due mainly to their elevated status within Mormon theology. This racial tolerance, however, by no means extended to African Americans. They were regarded as the cursed descendants of Cain, and continued to be discriminated against well into the 20th century. It was not until 1978 that black people could participate in temple ordinances, which are essential for salvation and exaltation within Mormon theology. So anyway, it was within that same year that the Mormon missionaries arrived that they had success. Many were baptized, and the first church was built near Rock Hill, South Carolina, nearby the Indian reservation. It became the first LDS church in America to be entirely staffed by Native Americans. By the 1910s, local opposition had diminished, and the majority of the Catawba Indian identified themselves with the church. As many as 2/3 of all Catawba Indians were Mormons. Their embrace of Mormonism was partially attributed to the respect and dignity they received from the church, which, as I said, contrasted with their treatment by others. The Book of Mormon's narrative resonated with them, offering them a sense of collective identity as a chosen people. In this narrative, they were given a dignified place within the divine history. If you think about Christian denominations, they're mostly European imports. They have built into them a kind of looking back to the old world. It's very much the white man's religion being brought across the ocean to the natives. Mormonism, at least mythologically speaking, was not that. It was homegrown. But more than that, its claim was that at its roots were these indigenous people, a lost and forgotten history. And so here was a people delusioned and unsure of their place in the world, and these people were being offered a narrative which put them front and center of God's divine plan. So this is as far as my research has got me so far. I don't really know how central Mormonism today in the 21st century is amongst the Catawba people. I would assume that they've followed national trends and that numbers amongst millennials and Generation Z are on the decline. It's difficult to imagine how the Catawba people are able to balance reclaiming their native heritage on one hand with their beliefs in Mormonism on the other. With other forms of Protestantism, it's easier, I think, to imagine holding both syncretically, as the historical legacy of both are entirely disentangled up until the arrival of Europeans. But Mormonism intentionally entangles itself with Indian heritage. It co-opts and re-narrativizes Indian history for its own ends. Indians are used by Joseph Smith as a kind of literary trope, a trope which acts as the foundation for Mormonism's elaborate theology. I think when deconstructed in this way, it would be difficult in the 21st century to reconcile yourself to this reality. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this content, then please do like, subscribe, and share this video. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.